All right. Well, this is probably the most dangerous part of the class because here we hit the 20th century. Now, most people aren't going to fight or quarrel over Constantine in 323. But when we talk about Easy Rider, Stuart's going to get mad if I don't get it right. So if y'all see a chair coming, just so I always tell my students, you don't run into trouble till you get to about the 1950s, because the closer you get to the current time, that's when people get more invested in what you're talking about. And so people, I've had good arguments when you get to the Reagan years and the Clinton years and on, because people lived through them and they're very emotionally involved. So that's where we'll hit today. I think we'll go ahead and get started. We probably still got some drifting in. Just a quick review of what we looked at before. A new scripture from Jeremiah 6:16. As Christians, we're called to be archaic. We're called to be a people from the past. All right. Jeremiah said, "Thus says the Lord, stand in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths, where the good way is, and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your souls." But they said, "We will not walk in it." All right. Remember in Jeremiah's day, the nation of Israel, the nation of Judah is straying. They're going off in different directions. They're following different gods. They're worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs and all that. And Jeremiah is trying to call them back. And here the Lord says himself, stand at the crossroads. Look for the ancient paths. In other words, in order to progress, what do you have to do? In order to progress forward, you have to go back to the standard that God calls you to, which is very contrary to what modern man says. Also, we're going to see tonight, remember we end it with Nietzsche, we end it with World War I, we end it with Verdun and a lunar landscape on Earth created by the artillery shells. Called progress into question and a lot of other things. In the 20th century, you're going to see those ideologies that we talked about in the 1800s, the 19th century, begin to bear fruit. So ideologies always bear fruit. Look at what he says in Romans. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful. All right, they rejected God and the knowledge of God. So what happened to them? But they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. That was the fruit of their rejection of God. Later on in the same passage, he talks about those who exchanged the truth of God for a lie. All right. History is the plumb line of theology. It's the plumb line of ideology. You'll see that working out in history, and you'll see whether or not it was good. For example, you look at Nietzsche, you see fascism, communism, world wars. Is that a philosophy we want to go with? No. All right. So you see the natural fruits of those things. Later on in the same passage, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. And then he talks about how it is towards the end when a civilization begins to decay. Right. Now look at what Jesus said though. Jesus said, "I have come that they might have life and that they may have it more abundantly." That's the fruit of following Christ. The fruit of rejecting God is futility in your thinking and the descent of man. Right? The fruit of following Jesus is not just life, but abundant life. And then he says, the thief does not come except to steal, to kill, and destroy. And that's what you're going to see in the 20th century. You're going to see that modern man is bought into the lie of modern philosophy, into science, into all these things, and it's going to begin to steal and kill and destroy him. The ideal was that if we rejected God and we broke forth, we broke away from those prejudices of the past, like Michelangelo's David, that we would progress into this utopia. But the 20th century was probably the biggest bloodbath in the history of the world, with genocide and world wars and holocausts and just any amount of evil that you can think of. So we didn't progress. We degressed. All right. So by the time you get to the 1900s, the Enlightenment had failed. The Enlightenment laid aside divine revelation, embraced human reason as the way to determine universal truth, as a way to ensure progress and to eventually reach utopia. But by the dawn of the 20th century, the Enlightenment had failed. World War I, modernism, all that caused the Enlightenment into question. Your philosophy had failed. Your 7 major philosophical schools, beginning with rationalism, ending with nihilism. Rationalism is that we can use our reason to determine universal laws. Nihilism says what? We can know nothing. We can know nil. So it's nihilism. That's where modern philosophy gets you. So modern philosophy has failed. Philosophy, love of knowledge, defined as the quest for knowledge and universal truths, died with Nietzsche. I have a good friend who teaches philosophy. I always like to point out, hey, Nietzsche put you guys out of business. He never thinks that's funny. Rare individual, appreciate my sense of humor. All right. Even the idea of progress is questioned. Now, progress comes from Judeo-Christian beliefs. If you study the ancient world, you study the Mesopotamians, you study the Egyptians, history is cyclical. It repeats itself, or it goes in cycles. It wasn't until the Jews came, and later on the Christians, that you have the idea of linear history, that history has a beginning point and an end point, and man progresses through there. That history is guided by God. That's a Christian view. Well, by the 1800s, the 19th century, that view of God guiding history is replaced now, and instead of God, you have 3 things that guide the idea of progress. It's Darwinian evolution. Now think about this. Do we question the ideal of progress? For the secular world, the ideal that we're progressing is just considered to be true in and of itself. Right? Part of that comes from Darwin. What did Darwin say? You start with single cells, or you start with simple life forms, and you progress to more complex life forms, right? Now you have to lay aside the ideal that mutations aren't usually progressive. They're what? They're destructive. Right? But it's the ideal that you progress. Why is it never de-evolution? Why don't you see complex organisms break down into more simpler forms? Right. Just think of the concept of order. How many of you have kids? All right. Does your kid's room naturally progress from disorder to order? Does that ever happen? No, it's the opposite. It's the opposite. It's not evolution, it's devolution of the room breaking down. It requires force and stuff. So, but Darwinian evolution is the ideal that evolution is moving us forward. In fact, if anybody in here enjoy comic books, who's to say we're the top of the evolutionary agenda? Anybody ever watch the X-Men? That's the next evolutionary stage. In fact, in the movies and in the comic books, you'll have Magneto arguing for, what is it, not Homo sapiens, but Homo supremians. I think it's what he calls it, the next step in the evolutionary process. And so that flows into the culture now in the comic books. But the idea that we're moving forward by Darwin. Also reason. The idea was that we could use our reason and begin to improve our world. And as you began to improve your world through rational acts, then your world, your civilization would progress upwards. And in science and technology, a lot of our idea of progress is based on science and technology, right? I started out on a TRS-80 computer, Commodore 64, and then my cell phone now has more capabilities than those computers did. So technologically, we've progressed, right? But now have we progressed as a species? See, a lot of times we'll equate technological progression now with us progressing as a species. All right? In fact, you can make the argument we might be better fed and stronger today, but intellectually we've actually declined. I mean, Jonathan Edwards is going to college at age 12. I can't remember what I was doing at age 12, but it wasn't college. All right. So those are the modern conceptions of progress, and that's what we base progress on. That's why when they were doing the bio of Steve Jobs, and they talked about, his invention that had changed the world. And the iPhone changes communication, it changes a lot of things, but did it really change man? It's still the same man that was in Babylon with Daniel is now just using an iPhone, but it's the same man. All right. And then the death and destruction of the Great War seriously questioned the modern conception of progress. It didn't rule it out, but it questioned it. In fact, you still have a firm belief in progress today. Give you a good example. Have you ever heard anybody say, talking about being on the right side of history? That shows that they have a belief in progress, that history is going ever upwards, ever forward, all right, on its own, not guided by God now. And so history is the ultimate judge of what's right and wrong. And so I heard someone the other day talking about homosexual marriage, and they said, I'm for it, and I'm going to be on the right side of history because it's always progressing. You read that passage in Romans, and we're not progressing. We're devolving downward. Now, science is also darkened. The early scientists were scientists because they believed in a rational God who created a rational universe. And if there was a rational God who created a rational universe, then we could discover the principles of that universe. All right? And that's why they went into science and looked for science. Most of the early scientists were Christians. They held a Judeo-Christian worldview. The church, in some cases, the Catholic Church did persecute them, but not in all. And a lot of times that gets blown out of proportion to what really occurred. Right? But science without God and without the inherent dignity of all men had not led to a golden age, but rather to social Darwinism, social engineering, eugenics, and eventually genocide on an unprecedented scale. All right? And we saw that, and we'll see that again tonight with Hitler, but we saw it starting out with Nietzsche. Now, modern man, Darwin laid the foundation for modern doctrines which attempted to prove that rational humans did not control their own fates. The Enlightenment said you were rational and could make a rational decision. Darwin says you're not rational, you're a what? You're an animal, and therefore you can be controlled by animal instincts, your environment, behavior patterns. And if you're an animal, you can be what? You can be trained. B.F. Skinner. All right. Pavlov's dog. Karl Marx said that you're a creature of economic self-interest, and so you're controlled by economic forces that you may or may not understand. But you're not rational, you're controlled by economic forces. Freud trumped him. He did one better. He said, you're controlled by forces you don't even know that you're being controlled by. Because it's all buried in here. All right? And the only way you can get it out is pay some guy big bucks to listen to you while you sit on the couch and babble. And basically hope you have a Freudian slip that'll give you insight into that subconscious. All right, so that catches us up. That just briefly summarizes what we looked at last week. Remember I said before that the United States is usually about 20 years behind Europe. A lot of that has to do with the Great Awakenings. It kind of set back the clock for us. Well, Europe goes through Nietzsche and Darwin and all that a little bit earlier than us. They're going through it in the 1890s, early 1900s. We get a little bit of it, but it doesn't hit full-blown into the United States until after World War I. All right? And that period's called the Roaring Twenties. All right? Give you an idea of what they looked like. From Judges 17:6, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It was the job of the king in Israel to always read the Word of God. In fact, he had to keep his own copy. He was the only one in the whole kingdom required to have a Bible study every day. And then he was to take that, and that was to become the standard for the nation. Well, in Judges, if Samuel's the writer, is telling us that there's no king in Israel, there is no standard. Everybody does what is right in his own eyes. Now, if you lose a universal standard, what then becomes your guiding light? Okay, what you think of that? If you get rid of the Judeo-Christian worldview, if you get rid of God and biblical revelation, and you get rid of philosophy, with nihilism and Nietzsche saying we can know nothing, then the only guide you have is yourself. All right? So there is no king, there is no standard. Everyone does what is right in his own eyes. The problem is, and this is jumping a little bit ahead, John Paul Sartre was an atheist. An atheist said that. He says, no finite point has meaning without an infinite reference point. If you take, do I have any engineers in here? I know I got a mathematician. All right. If you take, and I put a dot up here, what can you tell me about that dot?
That it started and there's an end. Oh, no.
What can you tell me about that? It's there. You can't even really tell me what there is, can you? What do you have to have? Yeah, what do we do with dots? Anybody remember all that algebra you forgot in 10th grade? You have to have that fixed reference point, and that is, and then you start counting out, right? Well, so, I'm a historian. Let's not get more complicated than that. All right. All right. In order for that, make it dimensional. In order for that thing to have a meaning, it has to have a fixed reference point to be in relation to. Well, what we've done by the 20th century and by the 1920s in the United States is we've erased any fixed reference points. And according to Sartre, I jumped ahead. Now all other points are meaningless. If you don't have that reference point, all other points become meaningless. Or you have to assign them meaning randomly. Now what does that do for cohesion in society? It's chaos. Basically in a republic or a democracy, it's going to be, all right, what can we get 51% to agree on? Because now there is no standard outside society itself. Francis Schaeffer, when there are no absolutes, society itself becomes absolute. All right, so now it's just what will society accept? And society becomes its own standard. And how well does that last? It doesn't. 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, if you talked about gay marriage, they would have laughed at you. Now we're here. I mean, society changes as a standard. Right?
40 years ago, if you said gay, they would have thought you were talking about a movie.
Yeah. So the term the Jazz Age was coined by F. Scott Fitzgerald. He used it because of the willingness of young people to experiment with new forms of recreation and sexuality. Jazz music, sex and new morality. You had movie theaters. You had kids going out now unsupervised. You had back seats in automobiles. And there are history books written on this of how the automobile, the ability to get away from parents, changes the sexual mores of the 1920s and 30s because now you can get out. All right. Movie theaters, now you darken the screen or you darken the room. And so it gives you a place to go outside of the home now. So no longer is dating and courtship supervised. All right. The flapper. Anybody know what the flapper is? It's not the thing in the toilet. And, there is one called the flapper. Claire Bow, the It Girl. So Brad, you remember this came out in 24? Yeah.
I was way too young.
But the whole definition of womanhood changed because now you don't have that fixed standard. So what does it mean to be a woman? If you're a Christian, you can still go back to the Bible. Yeah. But if you're not, what's the definition of a woman now? What is femininity? What
society says it is.
It's what society says it is. And so those begin to change. And you have, she's called the It Girl. She dresses now in tight-fitting clothing. She wears shorts. She smokes. She drinks. She goes to wild parties. And that now becomes the definition, at least that they're putting forth for womanhood. Here you see the magazine, McClure's magazine, and McClure's was the progressive journal of that era. So you can gauge what the elites are thinking about. And this is the flapper. What does she look like? She's very sexualized. The skirt's topped up. You can see most of her legs. She looks like a 17-year-old boy, doesn't she?
With her short hair, that was the other thing.
With the short bobbed hair. Yeah, the irony is you lose the definition of what it means to be feminine, and now you begin to move towards adolescent boys for some reason. The new era of consumerism. It's in the 20s that you have a consumer culture. All right, you have some advancements in communication technology. You have an affluent society. The war brought in a lot of money, a lot of technological changes. For the first time, advertising, and now the consumer culture where spending is seen as a virtue. Consumer goods fueled an economic boom that lasted from 22 to 29. And now we're not talking necessarily about big ticket items. We're talking about handheld cameras, wristwatches, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, linoleum. All right. The fall of our society, linoleum right there. Motion pictures, radio, telephones, and automobiles. Motion picture industry began, first moving picture show in New York City in 1896. The first movie house is in Philadelphia in 1905. 3 years later, there's 10,000 scattered across the country. Hollywood becomes the center of the industry in 1915. Why are movies so important to a culture? Escapism. But now, no matter where you are in the country, whether you're rural Appalachian, you're South Texas, you're in LA, you can all see the same movie. And it begins to conform our society. Why do all newscasters talk like Tom Brokaw? Because we've determined that the Midwest would be the language of our news. You ever notice none of them talk like me? But we become more standard as a culture. Now that's going to pick up a pace with what? This is movies. What really kicks it up a notch? Television. And now you can impact the whole nation with a show you put on for 30 minutes. Radio. WWJ in Detroit began broadcasting news bulletins from the Detroit Daily News, and KDKA of Pittsburgh began regular programs in 1920. All right. That's 22, you got your first radio commercial. Also that year, you got 508 stations and some 3 million receivers. And you begin to have your national broadcasting companies, NBC, CBS, and the establishment of Federal Radio Commission. Right. Airplanes. Now you can travel. It begins to make the world smaller for culture to be transmitted. Automobiles, we've talked about a little bit. Henry Ford wanted to make them available not just to the rich. He wanted to democratize them and sell them out. So he had a Ford Weekly Purchase Plan where you'd have a little savings book and you could gradually buy the same car because he wanted to sell more cars. Talked a little bit about the automobile there. All that came to an end in 29 with the stock market crash. After that, our experience in consumerism died out until after World War II when it'll pick back up again, and we'll see how that factors in here in a little bit. All right, so that was the 20s. It was what do you recall about the 20s from history class? The Great Gatsby, the movie that just came out. Prohibition. It was a period of turbulence, a lot of conflict, organized crime, all that going on. Right. It was the same way around the world. You had, especially in the European countries after World War I, France, Germany had lost a generation of people, the Italians as well. A lot of chaos there. And out of that chaos, you begin to have the rise of fascism. Now, fascism is a little bit hard to define because it takes on a lot of national elements. Fascism in Italy looks a little bit different than fascism in Germany. But I want to give you 5 elements of fascism. See if you can identify the ones that come out of Nietzsche. All right. The first of these was the importance of the irrational in national life. Remember, the Enlightenment was all about rationality. Fascism is going to focus on the irrational. In its way, it was a belief in opposition to the power of reason, an intense emotional nationalism, a deep sense of national destiny, and the power and purity of blood, race, and war. All those ranked high in fascist beliefs. George Will, when he came out with his political spectrum, he put fascism to the far right. I think he erred in that because the political system that came out of the 1900s was based on the Enlightenment. Fascism rejects the Enlightenment. It focuses on the irrational. All right, so it's a new entity. It's different. The glorification of violence. All right. Mussolini, Hitler are going to come to power because they have their own personal armies that swear allegiance to them, not to the state, but to them. And that's how they're going to come to power. And they'll glorify violence, thugism. Initial supporters, a lot of them came from the military. Mussolini just rounded up Italian veterans who had lost their jobs, who were displaced after the war. The government didn't give them their pensions. They were disgruntled. Mussolini began to organize them, and they become his own personal army. They adopt military themes and styles, the brown shirts, the black shirts, all that. The use of street violence and thugs to intimidate and silence political opposition. Right. And the use of terror as a political weapon. Another element the fascist movement shared was the leadership principle. Nations, especially great nations, were held down by wicked and destructive conspiracies. They had no time for liberal-minded politicians, for elections, and parliamentary majorities. What was called for was to find the great man provided by destiny and to trust and obey him. And then that great man would delegate to those under him, and his authority would flow out through them. Remember Nietzsche? Nietzsche argued that most men are sheep to be controlled by passion, but you would find a few who he called what? The supermen, who would, through their will to power, be able to impose their will on those around them. And so that's the element of fascism. You're going to find that leader who can impose his will on the nation and even on the world. And who are the first two? Mussolini and Hitler. So, even in modern times. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Now, it's a perversion of Christianity, because instead of looking for the Messiah, the Son of God, now what do you look for? A Messiah among men to lead you out and to impose your will. Mm-hmm. The fourth vital component was a deep belief in racism. All right? Fascists made much of the greater significance of the community, the people, as opposed to the individual. Remember, the Enlightenment was all about individual rights. This is about the community. And the true people were of one race who could only be held down through treachery. All right? So you get the Aryan superiority, especially in Germany, the Jews as the enemy. Now you think about Mussolini. Mussolini weaves this mythology, or not Mussolini, Hitler weaves this mythology around Nazi fascism. They're going to be what? What do they call Nazi Germany? The Third Reich. So he weaves this mythology about two other Reichs that existed before. All right. He goes back and he borrows myths from the Teutonic Knights and weaves them in there. He goes back to Wagner and takes his music and makes that a part. And he uses these propaganda films and these huge book burnings and public rallies, and he just throws passion in there, and it's all this irrational stuff. And he wields a political movement out of that. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that comes from Nietzsche. Now this is going to come from social Darwinism. The idea that certain races are higher than others. And if we believe in evolution, what happens to the weaker species? They die off. It's survival of the fittest. And if that guy can't make it on his own, then he's not fit enough to survive. And if he's not dying off quick enough, then we'll kill him, and that will better the progress of history. So all this stuff begins to tie in. Ideology always bears fruit. Finally, all fascists embrace totalitarianism. That is the obliteration of the boundary between public and private life. There is no realm in which the government should not be involved, according to the totalitarians. Everything should be controlled by the government, even religion. Mussolini got down to the concept of birth control because he wanted to create a Roman Empire and he needed more Romans, and he told the Italian people, you will not practice birth control because we need more Romans if we're going to expand out and have this Roman Empire again. And so he got even down into sexual relations. Hitler will draw up laws about who you're allowed to marry and who you're not allowed to marry based on racial ancestry. And even the whole idea of the Aryan race, blonde hair, blue eyes, was that Hitler? No, it's total opposite. But he creates this mythology about this, and that's what they aspire to. The question always gets asked in my Western Civ class, do we live in a totalitarian country today? I turn around and I ask the question, is there any area that's now safe from government? The government does not intervene by the very definition. All right. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with the man at the top either. That can just be our political system has progressed to that point. All right, so fascism exalted will and instinct over reason. It glorified action rather than thought and discussion. It was the ideal that in a crisis you do something. Doesn't matter if it's the right thing or the wrong thing. Inaction is the worst thing you can do. You always do something. And in fascism, as I said, exalted the leader who knew instinctively what was best for the nation, called for rule by a party elite which made decisions for the masses, and sought the one national will rather than individualism. Right. Fascism is very close to communism. You see a lot of themes in there. There's Mussolini and Hitler, your first fascists. You have others. You have Franco in Spain, others in Eastern Europe. We won't go through their rise to power, but you got Mussolini coming to power pretty quickly. Hitler's delayed a little bit because Germany does all right following the war. It's not until the Great Depression hits that he's able to get into power. His worldview is a mixture of racism, anti-Semitism, social Darwinism, and anti-Marxism. And he recognizes the importance of propaganda. In fact, he will have his own propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, called the Ministry of Popular Enlightenment. And they will Nazify, the Nazification of education. They take over the educational institutions. All right. Public rallies, terror. The ideal here is that you have to create a new man. You have to make people forget what came before. They have to forget all that individual rights stuff from the 1700s and 1800s. And now they have to become new men who can lay aside the individual and now embrace the will of the state and follow obediently and blindly the will of the great man, the Nietzsche Superman. And so you take over all the institutions. The communists will do the same thing. You take over the universities. You take over science now has to bend to the state. It's no longer the objective search for truth. It now has to serve the end of the state. History. Now history, you have useful history, where you go back and you make up things that support the ruling elite and what they're putting forth. And so you bend the state to you bend the society to the will of the government and to the will of the great man. We had a little bit of that ourselves. B.F. Skinner wrote Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And he talked about how you should use behavioral methods, behavioral adjustments on people. Because man did not have freedom and dignity. You had to go beyond that concept. The man is just an animal that can be trained. And so Francis Schaeffer will write a response to that. I think it's called Back to Freedom and Dignity. But that's where science gets you when you take away the Christian worldview of man as having inherent dignity because he's created in the image of God. Right? And this was published in the 70s. Right? So that's fairly recent. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a prisoner in the Soviet gulags. They weren't called gulags, they were re-education camps where you went and you lost your individuality and you were taught how to think right. One Day in the Life of Ivan Desinovich. It's a real quick read, about 100 pages. Talks about life in those camps and how they seek to strip you of your individuality and your personhood. And they got his writings out of Europe and out of the Soviet Union. It kind of exposed what was going on there. Eventually, the Soviets kick him out and they send him to America. And he continues to write here. I think he just died recently. But interesting note on that. You can look at the fall of communism, and the fall of communism, the people who led the fall of communism were the Christians, or the people who had deep ties to religion, either Judaism or Catholicism and all that. Solzhenitsyn was one, some of the others. Because what happens with the idea of progress, when you get rid of God, what do you have? What is beyond you now?
No hope.
Yeah.
That's where
Yeah.
alcohol-
Eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die. All right, it's a very despairing principle. Yeah. You lose, in the Western tradition, you lose the larger narrative. Going into the Civil War, Stonewall Jackson could look at the war and he says, if I die, I die. Because he was a staunch Calvinist. He believed God had already ordained the day of his death, and so he could ride into battle. If it's my day, it's my day, no matter what I do. And if it's not my day, it doesn't matter what they do. And he could go and he could look. And if I die, God's hand still moves history. There's still a larger purpose, and God will use my death down the line. But you take God out of it, and we're now simply animals. Are animals willing to die for a greater cause? No. That's why World War I is so devastating. By that time, you've lost traditional Christianity. Philosophy's failed you. You see all this carnage, and you wonder, why? And it causes despair. Those that fought communism had that larger narrative. The decline of the Western world during the 20 years between the wars, the democracies faced increasing domestic problems, challenges to their imperial holdings, they'll lose their empires eventually, and an inability to provide a united front against the forces of totalitarianism. One of the big things I think that pulled down the Western democracies was a loss of faith, not just in the Enlightenment, but in the ideal that Western civilization mattered, that it was a unique civilization. And the larger theme of history, guided by God. It's ironic that by the time you get to World War II, when they go into World War II, who do the British people call to take over? They call Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is not a product of the 20th century. Churchill was born in, I think, 1874. He was considered old by World War I in the 20s. He was disdained. After the 20s, he fell out of power, 30 years in the wilderness, where he warned against Hitler and the rise of Nazism, and they said, won't you shut up? You're a relic. Why don't you go away? You need to be kicked out. His own party turned against him on numerous occasions. But when it came to this crisis where it was life and death for the British Empire, they didn't look to a 20th century guy. They went back to the guy from the previous century. They went back to a guy who had those higher themes in mind. And if you read Churchill's speeches, he talks about a life and death struggle. His Blood, Sweat, and Tears talks about that if England falls, then the world plunges into a darkness that'll last for 1,000 years. And he holds these grander themes in mind. He sees history moved by God. And that's who they look to pull them through World War II. Interestingly, it's the same thing in the book of Judges. The Judges, right after Joshua and Caleb die and that generation begins to go and they fall into trouble, they go back and they get a guy by the name of Obadiah. Or not Obadiah. I'm blanking on his name. But they go back and they get this guy who was with Caleb in his battles, and they bring this old guy out of retirement and he leads them back to God. Same thing here. They go back to the old guy that has the grand themes of history in mind, that can make sense of the carnage and the chaos and can call them through. In World War II, you had others that fought against Nazism. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, you ever read The Scarlet and the Black or see the movie with Gregory Peck? It's about a priest who fought the Nazis in Rome and helped escape prisoners, helped to protect the Jews. Very good reading. And then Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a recent biography of him that came out. Bonhoeffer had went to the U.S. right before Hitler and them began to crack down, but once it began to get rough there, Bonhoeffer told his friend Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian, he said, I've got to go back. I can't stay here while my people have to make those hard choices. I have to go back if I plan to be a leader in restoring Christianity after the fall of Nazism. And he went back, he got arrested by Hitler, and within months before the end of the war, Hitler knew the end was coming, and supposedly, as the story goes, Hitler says, if I'm going down, I'm taking that blank priest with me. And he has Bonhoeffer shot, or I think he's hung. Christians stood up to fascism and to communism because they had those higher themes in mind, those biblical themes that God guided history. All right. Now, after World War II, see, this is the danger of teaching the 20th century in one class. You have to pass over World War II real quick. After World War II, nihilism is too dark. All right, it led to fascism, it led to the bloodbath. You just can't live that way. Nietzsche famously said, you're a bubble of emptiness on a sea of nothingness. You don't write that in a birthday card. You don't give that to people. He started out as a Hallmark writer and it didn't work, so he had to go to philosophy. It's just too dark to live by. And so what we do is we don't go back to the old philosophies because they've played out. We don't go back to Judeo-Christian values because we've rejected them. What we do is we now wholly embrace existentialism, the ideal that we determine our own truths. Instead of focusing on universal truths, you focus on the development of the individual. Give you some basic principles here of existentialism. Existentialism believed with Nietzsche that we can know nothing with certainty. We can't know universal truths. But what we can know is ourselves. Therefore, there are no ultimate universal truths. All the individual can know is the individual. All right? So each individual is unique, and one becomes human only to the extent that one realizes one's uniqueness. In the individual, thought must have a bearing on life and be translated into action. And then here's the dark part. Human beings are alone in the world. The universe is indifferent to human aspirations and needs. But humans are free. There is no God. Authentic existence comes as we choose freely. It's our choices that define who we are. And that's existentialism. The essence of what we are is found in our choices and our actions. Not in a God, not in philosophy, but in ourselves. We give ourselves meaning and we define truth for ourselves. Now, if we give ourselves meaning and we define what is true for us, what are we? We're gods. In fact, there was a book by that name, I think, We Are Gods, coming out of that era. That we now, we give ourselves meaning, we define truth for ourselves, we become God. As one theologian said, we go from the paganism of Paul to now the paganism of existentialism. All right, we're all individual gods determining our own value, determining our own truth. Have you ever heard somebody say, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me? Or they say all things are relative. That's existentialism. You still see the mottos of it. If it feels good, do it. That's not Western civilization. Western civilization used to teach, if it feels good, it's probably wrong. You know? And existentialism is a young man's philosophy, right? By the time you get into late 20s like I am, you know, late 20s. Existentialism sounds good in the college campus. It sounds good, when you're growing up and you're full of vim and vigor, but then you get older and you see the consequences of your actions. Yeah, what was I thinking? And it plays out. So yeah, existentialism sounds good, it doesn't. In your syllabus, I call it the rebirth of existentialism because this is essentially the same thing that Satan said to Eve. If you take of the fruit, you will be like God, determining good and evil, knowing good and evil. That's existentialism. You determine good and evil for yourself. It's the same thing. Now, originally this is put forth by the writers, Albert Camus, the plague. The plague was about this plague that broke out in Oran in Algeria. They had to seal off the city. It was an old walled city. And it's fiction, but it's a story about how life is absurd. There are no actual meaning to it, but people find meaning anyway by the actions they choose. Yeah. Sartre, some of the others. Simone, one is not born a woman, one becomes one. In other words, gender is now something that's taught, it's something that's conceived. Existentialism and art. Anybody a modern art fan? I'm not a modern art fan. That's Jackson Pollock. What is that? It's modern art. What is that?
That's a crayon thing that my kids used to do.
Yeah.
And
It doesn't. Art used to be form and freedom, right? I mean, you could, but you knew a tree was a tree. Who determines what that is?
The artist.
Each of you, not the artist, no. Each of you determines what that means to you. You ever see that guy standing there and he's got a wine glass and he says, "Oh, that means to me," or I think the artist here is saying, and you know how he got that? He took paint cans, hung them from the ceiling, poked a hole in it, and started swinging them over a canvas. If I caught my 7-year-old doing that, but he gets paid. That's $1 million painting. But that's how he formed it. It was the ideal that there would be, you can't make anything out of it, but it means whatever it means to you, and obviously it meant something to somebody because they paid good money for it. There he is. He'd just take paint and dribble them. He'd throw paint at the canvas. He did the bucket thing from the ceiling. That was Norman Rockwell's commentary on Jackson Pollock. Here you see a clash of worldviews. You see this guy. He's in a suit. Pollock's in the 50s. This guy's probably a World War II veteran, maybe a World War I veteran. He's got a military bearing. He's got the square shoulders. He's standing there in kind of relaxed formation, and he's just looking at this thing. And so this was Norman Rockwell's commentary on it. This is where you see a clash of culture. It's called the connoisseur. But you see definitely one theologian said that the 50s and the 60s were a watershed. You know what a watershed is? If you stand at the Continental Divide and I take a glass of water and I pour it right at the peak of the Continental Divide, that water's connected and then it splits and it starts off. Now when it starts out, it's right there together, right? But when it's done, it's a continent apart. 50s and the 60s are that watershed. We start out close together. By the time you get to the end of the 60s and the 70s, we're a continent apart. Existentialism in music. You lose form, you lose melody. Finally, you go from existentialism, because if you determine your own reality now, if you determine your own truth, you go into pantheism because nothing's wrong anymore. If worshiping Athena works for you, then that's good. It doesn't for me, I'll try Buddhism. And maybe Buddhism worked for me, because there is no universal truth. It's whatever works for you now. And so you get pantheism. I had a student one time who worshiped Athena. You get the New Age movement, which is really just paganism reheated. Eastern meditation and yoga. Anybody in here a Beatles fan? You can trace this in the Beatles music. They go from I Want to Hold Your Hand, Sgt. Pepper's about in the middle, and then you got Sexy Sadie after they get back from India after studying with the Maharishi. You know, and you see their music just progress through that. We began to even question language. If language is a human invention, can then it really convey what it's supposed to convey? Maybe language means one thing to me and it means something to you. Totally different. So how can we even share ideals now? Now this infiltrates the church. There's a movement out there called the emergent church, which holds the Bible in disregard because they say, well, the Bible's written in a human language, so how can that really convey an eternal God? And now the Bible goes silent for them. In the United States, it gets into what are called the beats. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, actors like James Dean and Marlon Brando. The desire to liberate self-expression, to surmount organizational constraints, and disregard traditional conventions was an abiding goal of the abstract expressionists and the small group of young writers, poets, painters, and musicians known as the Beats, the Beatniks. The road to salvation lay in hallucinogenic drugs and alcohol, sex, a penchant for jazz, and the street life of the urban ghettos, an affinity for Buddhism, and a restless vagabond spirit. The Enlightenment was about using your mind, but by the time you get to the 50s and now into the 60s, your mind is not enough. You got to do what? You got to expand your mind. And how do you expand your mind? Drugs and hallucinogenics, and so now you flow into this. After World War II, the veterans come back and they want to get on with their life. And so you have, they come back, they want personal peace and prosperity, as Francis Schaeffer called it. Right. They come back, they go to college, they go to work, they found corporations, they join corporations, they build a family. You introduce the TV culture. In 1946, you have 7,000 TVs. By 1960, 50 million. Right. Advertising again from the 20s, and now credit cards. Shopping centers. In 1945, you got 8 shopping centers. If we'd only go back. By the 1960s, you got 3,840. Right. Shopping from World War II on now becomes a part of our culture. You know, it just becomes something you do. It's part of our leisure activity. It's not what I do, but as you can tell, you know. I get new clothes if my wife buys them. That's about it. But you know, shopping now becomes a part of our culture. Development of a youth culture. Teens, they buy into the consumerism, corporatism, and conformity. Now that was their generation, but the generation that comes after, the baby boomers, they inherited unprecedented economic prosperity, educational opportunity, and social mobility. Unprecedented in world history. They also inherited some tensions in the social order. All But it's going to be that generation that rebels against their parents. Their parents were about personal peace and prosperity. Now they're going to rebel. They want to redo the system. They will be the ones that embrace the drug culture, the sexual revolution, and some of the others. How many of you have watched Easy Rider? All right, that was the longest 6 days of my life. It's only an hour and a half movie, but that's the longest 6 days. All right. In Western literature, you have this theme of the road. It's in a lot of your stories. All right, and it's a metaphor for life. They go on a road trip. They go from LA after they sell a bunch of drugs they smuggled in from Mexico. They get the money to go on a road trip. They're going from LA to New Orleans and eventually to Florida. What's the purpose of their road trip? What is their journey of discovery?
For themselves. Find a very open road.
Yeah, there isn't a progression. There isn't a journey of discovery. It's about just a series of disjointed experiences, one after the other. All right? And so eventually end up dead on the side of the road. You know? That is existentialism. It's about the choices they made, the experiences they had, and when it's all over, there's no larger purpose to it. Yeah. You're dead on the side of the road, yeah.
There's also an attack on certain cultural things that they didn't approve of.
It was an attack on it. The interesting thing about this is how in the movie they tried to make the counterculture movement the inheritors of the American life. And you saw these guys, you see them driving down the road and they're passing these cowboys. You see these scenes of cowboys off to the sides and they all wave at each other. It's almost like one generation of cowboy to the next. In fact, when they filmed this movie, Peter Fonda, Dennis Hopper wanted to make a modern Western. And so what they mean by this is a man went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere. This is Jack Nicholson on the back. And there's a scene where they're sitting there. They just got ran out of this local restaurant. I think they're in Louisiana by this point. And yeah, and the rednecks there. And they're talking about it. And Nicholson says, the problem is people are scared of you. Or Hopper says, why are people scared of us? And Nicholson says, they're not scared of you. They're scared of what you represent. You represent freedom. It makes them scared and dangerous. You remember this movie? Sure, you forgot the make it scared and dangerous. And it's the idea. And he said, people talk about freedom all the time, but when they see somebody that's truly free, makes them scared.
But James, one of the in your previous, because this is my time too, one of your previous characterization of this era was going against the organized institutions, and so that's what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
And they realized that freedom really is under. They didn't find it.
Well, it's a new definition of freedom.
Yeah.
The founding fathers didn't talk about freedom. They talk about liberty. And if you look at how they defined it, liberty was the ability to choose to do what was right. And they drew a distinction between liberty and licentiousness. Licentiousness was the ability to do whatever you wanted. But now how do these guys define freedom? Doing whatever you wanted. So they redefined the American dream. They redefined what freedom means in the American context. And that's what the movie was all about. But in the roads theme, you get some of the other stuff of existentialism. All right, now the counterculture movement failed. The reason it failed is because a lot of them died. All right? Just like the end of the movie Easy Rider. And I'm not joking. Think of the major musicians from this period. Hendrix, yeah, they're dead. Yeah. Morrison, they die. So death is a problem. The other problem is, death is a problem. Yeah. Profound things from your as one historian put, one of the other problems is they produced more babies than bread. All right. That they were unable to deal with the practical side of life. You had these communes, you had these worker communes out there. In Easy Rider, they visit this one where they're trying to plant these crops and bring it in. And the problem is they're more interested in pleasure and experiences than they are in hard work. And so they go out and they can live this life, but they have to depend on the functional members of society to support them. Or they have to get involved in crime, like the drug deal, to pay for the trip across the country. Consumerism, basically corporate America took the counterculture movement and sold it. All right. Several of you in here are wearing status symbols from the counterculture movement. Brad's got one on. Jeans. The counterculture movement, you wear blue jeans to identify with the workers because the workers wore jeans. Now, jeans are mainstream. They've been commercialized and you just sell them like hotcakes. Che Guevara, this huge revolutionary force. Good night. Corporate America turned him into a huge marketing symbol. All right. The other thing is these guys are not consistent. Rock groups singing about the corruption of capitalism are doing what? They're selling their records, they're printing T-shirts, capitalism is horrible. Here, buy my T-shirt. And it's for Dwayne, yeah, and so it's the inconsistency there, but it gets commercialized. Even bead shops and health food shops come out of that. Yeah, Woodstock. Now it succeeded, and those coming out of the 60s completely rejected the Judeo-Christian mindset and the foundations. Existentialism and nihilism become mainstream. Feminism, however you define it. If you look at the history of feminism, it's defined as different things at different times by different people because we've lost that fixed reference point. All right. Triumph of gay rights. Separation of church and state redefined. We talked about that in an earlier lesson. So they did succeed in certain areas. They failed in others. They succeeded in some. I do not include the civil rights movement in this because the civil rights movement came out of the Judeo-Christian perspective because it was led by who? The who? What's his title? The Reverend Martin Luther King. And it came out of the African American churches. Now what happened is that's in the 50s. By the 60s, when you get into black power and violence, it's left the Judeo-Christian background. And now it's moved into different areas, and you get the Black Panthers and all this stuff. That's when it gets secularized, and then it splinters into violence and all that chaos. All right, now the intellectual response to existentialism begins in the 30s, the 40s, really takes off after the war. J.R.R. Tolkien, he takes the narrative of the road, the narrative of hardship, and he puts in there the larger themes. That even suffering has a purpose. It's not the absurd, according to Camus. It's just not one experience after another, according to Easy Rider. The whole Lord of the Rings trilogy is about this road trip taken to confront evil. Clive Staples Lewis, C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, recapturing that larger theme of history. Francis Schaeffer began in Le Brie in Switzerland. Starts an institute there, begins to write and preach, confronting existentialism. There's Tolkien, Lewis, there's Schaeffer. I also include Pope John Paul II. Came out of Nazism, fascism, confronted communism. Basically from the 20s to 2005, grew up in Poland during World War II, had to attend seminary underground. Even under the communists, he went underground to fight them. In '79, he goes back into Poland, and he's one of the founding members of the Solidarity movement with Lech Walesa and some of those guys when they rebel and they turn out to show out the Pope. He's considered so much a threat to the Soviets, they try to kill him in '81. It was a Bulgarian that actually did it, I think, but the KGB was behind it. One of my favorite portraits of the Pope because this is later on in life, and the Pope suffered from Parkinson and several other problems, but would not retire as Pope. And the reason he didn't retire is because he wanted to confront the youth culture of the day, the ideal that it's youth that matters. And he wanted to show that all people, even the elderly, even those suffering from terminal disease, had value and dignity and worth. And so he stayed in the papacy until the very end. Yeah. And the guys that went before him, Tolkien and Lewis, and both of their narratives, they were very conscious when they set out to write that they wanted to recapture that grand scheme, that history had purpose. And they wanted to restore friendship. In fact, there's a book, I forgot to include it in your additional sources, but it's called On the Shoulder of Hobbits by Louis Marcos out of Houston University, or Baptist University of Houston. And he talks about their friendship and how they tie back into the classical values, back into Judeo-Christian values. And so it's a very good book. I think it's only like $11. Well worth the read there. But that's where you end. Question is, as Schaeffer put it, what are we to do now? How do Christians respond to where we're at today? Because we're still in existentialism. No philosophy has pulled us out. Philosophy is not going to pull us out, all right, because philosophy died with Nietzsche. One of the things we have to do is we have to understand the times. We have to equip ourselves to confront and destroy the ideologies that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God. And then we got to engage the culture. We got to build upon the foundation laid by Christ and build a culture that is under the headship of God. One of the things I hope you've seen over these past 4 weeks is God looks for individuals who will stand up. And it can be somebody as insignificant as a German monk who is also a professor of theology, and starts preaching the Bible. And God will use that. We're called to strengthen what remains. That means our individual lives. If we want to make a difference in the world, we have to make sure that we're in our Bibles, that we're in church, that we're having a quiet time, that we're praying. This is not revolutionary stuff. But this is stuff that will lead to revolutions in our lives. We have to strengthen the family. Remember I said God created 3 institutions as foundations for civilization: the family, the church, and government. We have to do what we can in each one. We have to strengthen our families. We have to strengthen our churches. And then we do what we can about the government. All right? But we have to focus in those areas. And if you can't do anything here, you can definitely do something there. All right? And then we have to focus heavily on Christian education. And this is not a plug for parochial schools or anything like this. This means that Christians have to educate themselves about Christianity. All right? Systematic theologies. Know what you know. When Satan confronted Jesus in the wilderness, Jesus defended himself with knowledge from
Scripture.
where in Scripture? Which book? Deuteronomy. Could you defend yourself against Satan with your knowledge of Deuteronomy? Yeah, but God had that. I couldn't. But God had that. Jesus had that background. He could do it. We have to know our Bibles. We have to know what the world is doing out there and be able to confront it. And then we have to speak boldly about it. And if we go down like Wycliffe and Huss, then we go down, but we stand firm. God doesn't call us to be successful. He calls us to be faithful in these things. All right, Ezekiel 22:30. So I sought for a man among them who would make a wall and stand in the gap before me on behalf of the land, that I should not destroy it. But I found no one. My hope is that's not what God's going to say about the United States in 2013. That I looked for a man or a woman to stand up, and I found no one. That make sense? All right, the start of that is understanding where the world has brought us, and now we begin to confront it. So, but I'll end there with Ezekiel. You have an evaluation guide. If you'll take a few minutes to fill that out and just put it on the chair. On the back are a list of topics. We've talked about doing this again, not every month or whatever, but scattered throughout the year. And if there's a particular topic on there that you'd like to study or think would be interesting, mark that, and we'll see if we can get something that a lot of people like. But thanks for hanging in there for 4 weeks. Like I said, we went from the 1300s, or 323 in one case, to the dawn of the 21st century. We covered a lot of ground. Let's say a word of prayer and then we'll break. Lord, I just want to thank you for these men and women and their willingness, dear Lord, to look at history and see where we've come as a civilization, dear Lord. Pray, dear Father, that you would make us strong, that you would help us, dear Lord, to look at the things of the world and to tear down, dear Father, the things that are built on error, and to build up, dear Lord, on the foundation that is Christ. Give us that strength, give us that wisdom, give us that courage, dear Lord, to confront error, to confront heresy, and, dear Lord, just to confront the lies of the enemy. Pray this in your Son's name. Amen.